The day they read Gideon Voss's will, 6 men laughed before the lawyer finished the last sentence. Not polite laughter, not the kind men use to soften a room. This was the other kind, immediate, certain, the kind that doesn't wait for permission, the kind that has already decided the outcome before anything has begun. Loretta Voss sat at the far end of the table and listened to all of it. She did not look at the floor. She did not look at her hands. She looked at each man one at a time, and she counted. 6. She noted their faces the way she had once noted flaws in fabric, without judgment, without feeling, just observation. That one near the window, arms crossed before the lawyer opened his mouth. The two by the door already leaning toward each other, Calhoun Brister standing rather than sitting, hands in his jacket pockets, watching her face instead of the document being read aloud. She noted that last detail especially. Most people in that room were laughing at what was being said. Calhoun Brister was watching to see how she received it. That was a different thing entirely. The lawyer's name was Petford. He had the careful voice of a man accustomed to delivering bad news in neutral tones, and he read from the document without inflection, without apology, without any indication that he found the contents unusual. 14 acres of basalt slope in the Dusk Pine Ridge area, Sublette County, Wyoming. One timber structure, single room, condition unverified. One cave formation, naturally occurring, documented but undeveloped. That was when the laughter began in earnest. Someone said it aloud. A cave. A pause, then she inherited a cave. Loretta heard it. She did not respond to it. She was still watching Calhoun Brister, who had still not laughed, who was still watching her, whose expression had shifted slightly in a way she could not yet name. Petford continued reading. The land had been purchased 17 years prior by Gideon Randolph Voss, her uncle, for the sum of $400. It had been assessed by the county 3 times in the intervening years. Each assessment had returned the same conclusion: marginal agricultural potential, negligible mineral value, no access road beyond the county line, no utilities, no improvements of note. Petford set the document down. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "your uncle has left you 14 acres of ridgeland, a structure that has not been inspected since 2019, and a geological feature that the county considers a liability rather than an asset." The room had not fully quieted. Someone was still chuckling near the back. Loretta folded her hands in her lap. She said, "Did my uncle receive any offers on the land?" The laughter stopped. Petford glanced at his notes. There were 3 purchase inquiries over the years, all declined. Who made them? A pause, brief but present. It was Calhoun Brister who answered, not Petford. County had an interested party some years back. It was a fair offer given what the land is. Loretta looked at him directly for the first time. "You said fair offer. My uncle declined 3 times. What was fair about an offer a man refused 3 times?" Nobody laughed at that. Calhoun's jaw moved slightly. He said nothing. Loretta turned back to Petford. "Is there anything else?" There was not. She thanked him. She stood without assistance. She collected her coat from the rack near the door, and she left the office, and she walked to her truck in the parking lot behind the building, and she sat in the driver's seat for exactly 4 minutes before she started the engine. She did not cry. She had not cried at her husband's funeral 3 years prior, not because she had not loved him, but because crying was something she did privately in her own time, in her own way. She had learned over 67 years of living that grief expressed publicly tends to become performance, and she had no interest in performing for anyone. What she did sitting in that truck was think. Gideon Voss had been her mother's brother. She had known him her entire life, though she had not known him well. He was the kind of man who existed at the edges of family gatherings, present quiet, occasionally saying something that nobody quite understood and everyone politely ignored. He had worked for a mining survey company in his 30s and 40s, had retired early to pursue what the family called his project, and had spent the last 17 years of his life on a ridge in Wyoming, measuring things that, as far as anyone could tell, did not need measuring. He had died in November 2 years ago. She had attended the funeral. There had been no one else from the family. She had not expected to be in his will. She had not thought about it. And now she was sitting in a parking lot in Dusk Pine, Wyoming on a Tuesday morning in October, having just been told she owned a cave, and 6 men had laughed, and Calhoun Brister had not laughed. And that difference felt like the only thing in the room that mattered. She started the engine and drove toward the ridge. The county road ended where the map said it would at a gravel turnaround 3 miles from the base of the Dust Pine Formation. A hand-painted sign on a post read private property. Past this point, though the post had leaned at a 30-degree angle for long enough that the lean seemed intentional now. Loretta parked. She changed into her walking boots in the Gwen, an act that required more patience than it once had, her hands slower and stiffer than they had been at 50, at 40, at 30. She noticed this without complaint. It was simply a fact. Facts were adjustable. You worked around them. She took her pack, a canvas bag she had used for 2 decades, patched at one corner with a square of denim she had cut from a pair of her husband's old work pants, and she walked. The path Gideon had used over 17 years had compressed the soil enough to remain visible even now, 2 years after his last footfall. She followed it without difficulty. The grade was gentle at first, then sharper as the ridge asserted itself, and the scrub grass gave way to exposed rock, and the wind came in off the high country with that particular Wyoming character, not violent, just absolute, present, unapologetic. She was not a young woman. She knew this. She stopped twice on the climb, not because she could not continue, but because stopping to observe was a habit she had never seen reason to break. The first stop gave her a view back toward Duskpine, a small town visible in the valley below a water tower, a gas station, the squat rectangle of Calhoun Brister's building supply store with its faded painted logo on the south wall. The second stop gave her nothing to look at except rock and sky and the quality of the air changing as the elevation changed. She noted that the air at the second stop felt different, not warmer, not colder, something else, something more difficult to name. She continued. The cliff appeared without announcement. One moment the path was rising through scattered pine, and the next moment there was a wall of dark basalt, vertical, unbroken, and in the face of it an opening. Not large, not dramatic, just a gap in the stone perhaps 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, the edges worn smooth in the manner of formations that have experienced the same conditions 10,000 times and have long since stopped reacting to them. She stood at the entrance and felt the air coming out of it. Not a wind, not a draft, something slower and more deliberate than either of those words. A steadiness, as if the cave were breathing at a rate so slow that calling it breathing at all seemed presumptuous. Loretta stood there for a long time. A person standing at a cave entrance in October in Wyoming ought to feel the cold. She felt it behind her in the air from the open slope in the wind off the high country. But at the cave mouth the air was something else. Not warm, not inviting in any comfortable sense, just stable, as though the temperature had made a decision years ago and saw no reason to revisit it. She reached into her pack and took out the small thermometer she kept there, a habit from decades of working in a shop where temperature affected how fabric behaved. She held it at the cave entrance for 3 minutes, 51 degrees Fahrenheit. She turned and held it in the open air behind her. 38 degrees, 13 degrees. A 13-degree difference, and October had barely started. She did not feel hope. She did not feel vindication. What she felt was something closer to recognition, the sensation of a pattern becoming visible. She had felt it before many times in her work, when a problem that had resisted understanding for days suddenly arranged itself into something legible. Not joy, not relief, recognition. She put the thermometer away and walked toward the cabin. Gideon's structure stood 30 yards below the cave entrance, slightly downslope, position she noticed at an angle to the prevailing wind rather than facing into it. Whether that was intentional or simply where the ground had been flattest, she could not yet say. The cabin was one room, log and board construction, the logs grayed and checked from years of sun and cold, the boards warped slightly outward along the west wall, where moisture had worked its way through repeatedly. The roof sagged on the western end. The door had dropped in its frame and required lifting slightly to open, which she accomplished by feel after the second attempt. Inside, the air moved, not violently, constantly, through gaps at the window frame, through the separation between 2 wallboards on the north side, through the space where the stovepipe met the ceiling. The cabin breathed cold in from multiple directions, and whatever heat a fire might have produced inside this room would have followed those same pathways directly back out into the October afternoon. This was not a design flaw. This was the absence of design. There was a difference. Loretta stood in the center of the single room and turned slowly, cataloging. A wood stove, cast iron intact. A narrow platform bed along the east wall bare, a table, one chair, a shelf with 4 tins of food and 3 mason jars of dried beans. A window on the south faced the pane intact, but the frame set loosely in the wall. And on the floor near the rear wall, she noticed it because she was looking for things that didn't belong to their category, a section of flooring that did not match the rest. Not in material, in sound. She pressed her boot down on it, then on the boards beside it. The surrounding floor gave a low, even contact sound. This section gave a sound with a hollow space beneath it. Not the hollow of rot or damage, a hollow with dimension, with intention. She knelt. The boards were fitted more tightly than the rest of the floor, with a single gap at one end large enough to hook a finger through. She had to pull twice before the section came free, 3 planks together cut to act as a unit. Below them was a void in the earth, perhaps 3 feet deep, lined with flat stone and sealed at the bottom with a layer of oil-treated canvas. Inside the void were 17 books. Not books, journals, composition notebooks, the kind sold at every pharmacy and hardware store in the country, the covers stiffened and warped by years of temperature change, each one labeled in the same precise hand, a number a year, a compass direction. 1 through 17, each one a year. 17 years of whatever Gideon Voss had been doing alone on this ridge. Beside the journals, a mercury thermometer in a leather case. A small level, the kind a carpenter carries in a shirt pocket. A measuring rod, wooden, the markings added by hand in permanent marker, at intervals that did not correspond to any standard unit she recognized. Gideon's own scale calibrated to something she did not yet understand. And beneath the journals, separated from them by a square of canvas, a single envelope. She recognized her name on the front in Gideon's handwriting. She sat down on the floor with her back against the rear wall and held the envelope for a moment before opening it. Inside was not a letter. It was a folded sheet of drafting paper, the kind used for technical drawings, creased along 4 lines into 1/8, the creases worn soft from repeated handling. She unfolded it carefully. A cross-section drawing, hand-rendered in pencil with dimensions noted in the margins. A line representing the ridge in profile. A mark indicating the cave entrance. A mark indicating the cabin. Between them, a series of connected segments, 3 of them each angled slightly off the axis of the previous one, each labeled with a note too small to read without her glasses. She put her glasses on. The note said reduce velocity, buffer zone, controlled entry, door required. It was a passage, an underground passage segmented and offset designed to connect the cave to the cabin floor. Not to move air freely, the design was explicitly aimed at the slowing air movement, breaking it into smaller units, stripping it of the speed that allowed it to carry heat away. The principle, as far as she could determine from the drawing alone, was not to import warmth. It was to import stability, to give the cabin access to the same thermal constancy that made the cave feel different from the open air. At the bottom of the drawing, in smaller letters, a single line, finish what the mountain started. She sat on that floor for a long time. Outside, the October light had begun its early western descent. The wind had picked up, slightly pressing against the north wall, finding every gap that wall had to offer. The temperature inside the cabin was already following the temperature outside immediately, obediently, without resistance. That was the problem Gideon had spent 17 years trying to solve. Not with insulation, not with a bigger stove, with geometry, with the understanding that you do not fight instability by adding more of something. You fight it by connecting to something that does not move. She opened the first journal and began to read. Gideon's handwriting was small and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who believed that recording something accurately was worth whatever time accuracy required. The first journal began on a March day 17 years prior. The entry noting that he had purchased the land on a Tuesday had arrived. The following Saturday, had slept in his truck the first 2 nights because the cabin floor was not yet trustworthy, and had taken his first temperature reading at the cave entrance at 6 in the morning on his 3rd day. 53 degrees Fahrenheit. March. Outside, 19 degrees. He had written differential confirmed. The question is whether it holds. Everything holds until it is tested. She read that and set the journal down for a moment. Those were not the words of a man who had bought worthless land without knowing what he had. Those were the words of a man who had suspected something and had come to verify it. He had not been romantic about it. He had not been hopeful. He had been methodical. She read through the first journal in its entirety that evening, sitting at Gideon's table with his oil lantern burning because the cabin had no electricity. The first year's entries were dense with data temperatures, times dates, weather conditions, compass readings for wind direction, estimated air velocity at the cave mouth, using a method Gideon described in precise detail. He had calibrated his measurements against a standard thermometer he had purchased before coming, and he checked that calibration monthly. He had been building a record that no one could argue with. He had been building the kind of evidence that wins when it is tested by people who doubt it. 12 years ago, she learned from the third journal the county had twice attempted to compel him to either fence the cave as a hazard or transfer the parcel to the county on grounds of dereliction. He had appeared at both proceedings with his journals, all 12 years of them at that point. He had presented temperature records, air movement records, a hand-drawn map of the cave interior that was more detailed than anything the county's files contained. He had argued quietly and with complete command of his evidence that the cave was not a hazard but a resource, that he was actively studying it, that his records met or exceeded the documentation standards applied to commercial geological surveys. He had won both times. The county had not tried again. She set the third journal down and looked at the drawing again. The channel, 3 offset segments, 2 internal barriers, 1 controlled entry door at the cave connection point. Gideon had begun the first segment. She found reference to it in the 14th journal, written 5 years ago when he had been 76. He had dug 14 feet before the soil composition changed to a kind that he could not safely excavate alone, and his hands had begun to fail him. He had documented the problem with the same absence of self-pity he applied to everything else. Hands unreliable at sustained pressure. Progress halted at 14 feet. Section 1 incomplete. Segments 2 and 3 not begun. The design holds. The body does not. He had stopped writing about the channel after that. He had continued measuring temperatures at the cave entrance every morning until the last entry in the 17th journal, dated 14 months before his death, when the handwriting had become large and unsteady, and the entry was only 8 words long. Steady again this morning. 51. It holds. Loretta closed the 17th journal and sat in the dark for a few minutes before relighting the lantern. She had not known her uncle well. She had known him as a peripheral presence, reliable, quiet, consistently present at the right moments, consistently absent from the wrong ones. She had not known until tonight that he had spent 17 years building something he could not finish. She had not known that he had fought for it twice in county proceedings and won both times. She had not known that he had designated her by name in a will he must have written years before his death, anticipating that she specifically would be the one to come. She thought about that for a while. He had not left this land to a son or daughter. He had no children. He had not left it to any organization or institution. He had left it to her, a 67-year-old widow who had spent her working life managing a sewing workshop in Nebraska, who had no engineering credentials and no geological background, and nothing to recommend her for the task except perhaps the fact that Gideon had watched her for enough years to conclude that she was the kind of person who finished things. She thought about Calhoun Brister, who had not laughed in that room, who had watched her face instead of listening to the document being read, who had answered her question about offers before the lawyer could, who had said it was a fair offer without being able to say what made it fair. She thought about what a fair offer would be for land that had no agricultural value and no obvious mineral value and nothing on it except 17 years of recorded temperature data and an incomplete underground passage and a cave that maintained 51 degrees in October in Wyoming. She thought about who would know enough to make that offer. She did not arrive at a conclusion that evening. She arrived at a direction which was more useful. Conclusions close things. Directions open them. She made a fire in the stove. The stove worked well enough. The problem was not the stove, and she felt the heat it produced leave the room through 8 different gaps she had already identified, and several she suspected but had not yet confirmed. She did not try to seal them tonight. She was not yet ready to build. She was still reading. She pulled the 14th journal back off the pile. She wanted to understand exactly where Gideon had stopped and why, and what he had understood about the problem that had not yet made it into the drawing. There would be time for everything else. The mountain was not going anywhere. On the 5th morning, she heard the truck before she saw it. She was outside, standing near the cave entrance with the thermometer, recording the morning reading, 49 degrees at the cave mouth, 22 degrees in the open air when the sound of a vehicle on the gravel below the tree line reached her. She wrote down her numbers first. Then she walked back toward the cabin and waited. Calhoun Brister drove a late-model pickup, dark green, well-maintained in the way that working trucks in Wyoming tended to be, not for appearance, for necessity. He parked at the edge of the usable ground and walked the remaining distance to where she stood at the cabin door. He did not greet her by name. He said, "It's a long way up." "It is," she said. He looked at the cabin, at the cliff face above it, at the cave entrance visible in the rock. He did not look at her directly when he said, "I wanted to come up personally, make sure you are getting on all right." "That's considerate," Loretta said. "What was the offer?" He met her eyes then. A long pause. 9,000 for the parcel as recorded. Land structure, cave formation. My uncle turned down 3 offers. Yes. What was the first offer? 3,000. And the last before this one? 4,500. Loretta looked at him. You're offering 9,000 for something that was worth 4.5 to you 2 years ago. The land hasn't changed. The cabin hasn't changed. The cave hasn't changed. A pause. So what has Calhoun looked past her at the cave entrance? His jaw worked slightly. Then it's still a fair price. I didn't ask if it was fair. I asked what changed. He looked at her for a moment longer, and she saw it again. The same thing she had seen in the lawyer's office. The same calculation behind his eyes. The assessment of whether she was what she appeared to be, or whether she was something else. Something that would require a different approach. He turned and walked back to his truck. She watched him drive away through the trees. Then she went back to the cave entrance and stood in the steady air for a long time. He knew something about this land. He had known it long enough to raise his offer by 100% when the person who had previously stood between him and the land was no longer standing there. He had watched her in that office to determine whether she was a 67-year-old widow from Nebraska who would sell inside a week or whether she was something that would take longer to deal with. She went inside and opened the journal to the page where Gideon had written about his first conversation with the county's interested party. She found it in year 12. One paragraph. One sentence that she had noted the previous night but not yet given its full weight. They know about the gradient. They have known for 10 years. They are waiting for the land to change hands to someone who does not. She sat with that sentence for a long time. Then she opened the 18th journal, the blank one she had brought from Nebraska in her canvas bag, bought at a pharmacy in Cheyenne on her drive-through, and she wrote her first entry. October. Elevation 7,400 feet approximately. Cave mouth temperature 49 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside air 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Differential 27 degrees. He knew something about this land, and he is waiting for me to not know it. I intend to disappoint him. She put the journal down and looked at the drawing. The mountain had kept its own time for longer than any of the men in that room had been alive. It would continue keeping it. The only question was whether she would learn to read it before someone else decided to read it for her. She pulled on her work gloves and went outside to find the place where Gideon had stopped digging. She would know by the ground. She always knew by the ground. She found the place where Gideon had stopped on the second day of looking. It was not marked. He had not left a stake in the ground, or a flag on a wire, or any of the signs a person might expect from someone who intended to return. But the ground told her what she needed to know. A section of earth along the line between the cabin's rear wall and the base of the cliff had been disturbed and then settled again over 5 years of frost cycles, leaving a faint depression that ran 14 feet from a point 2 feet out from the foundation before ending at nothing. The soil above it had a different color, darker worked, compressed from above rather than below. She stood at the end of the depression and looked back at the cabin wall, then forward toward the cliff. 14 feet done, roughly 60 feet remaining. She did not think about the full distance. She thought about the next foot. That was something she had learned in the sewing workshop over 4 decades. Not from any book, not from any instruction, but from the accumulated experience of watching people fail at things they were entirely capable of doing. They failed because they looked at the whole problem, the whole bolt of fabric, the whole order, the whole season's inventory. They saw the distance between where they stood and where they needed to be, and that distance became the obstacle instead of the destination. The people who finished things reliably without drama were the ones who had learned to look only as far as the next seam. She went to the cabin and got the short-handled spade from the corner where she had leaned it the day before. She put on her work gloves. She went back to the end of the depression and began. The first week was slow, not because the work was beyond her. She was 67, not 87, and she had spent 4 decades on her feet managing a physical operation. She was slower than she had been, and she knew it, and she adjusted for it, and she did not apologize to herself for the adjustment. What made the first week slow was the ground itself. Below the surface frost, the soil was dense and rooted a layer of compressed organic material that had been accumulating and compressing since before Gideon bought the land. She worked in short sections, breaking the ground first with the narrow end of the spade, then working the loosened material out with a garden trowel she had brought from Nebraska in the bottom of her canvas bag. She hauled the removed earth in a bucket to a depression 50 feet down slope where it would not drain back toward the work. She built the walls as she went, not after. Gideon's journals had been specific about this. Building as you go prevents collapse at the edges. Waiting until the trench is complete and then reinforcing is the approach of a person who has never watched a trench collapse. She used the boards she found stacked in the lean-to behind the cabin. Gideon had prepared them, cut and stacked and oiled against weathering, precisely the right dimensions for the channel walls. He had done at least that much before his hands had failed him. She placed them not flush against the earth, but half an inch out from it, creating a thin airspace between the wood and the soil wall. The principle was simple. Direct contact transfers heat. Separation slows it. Every layer mattered. Every fraction of separation mattered. By the end of the first week, she had added 9 feet to Gideon's 14, 23 feet total, slightly more than a third of the distance. She was tired in the evenings in a way that was deeper than muscle fatigue, a tiredness that settled into the bones and the joints, that did not fully release overnight and carried forward into the next morning. She noted this the way she noted everything, without alarm, without complaint. It was information. It meant she needed to be more deliberate about rest, about food, about the order in which she allocated her energy during the day. She adjusted. She rested in the middle of the day rather than pushing through. She ate more than she was accustomed to. She worked earlier and stopped earlier, using the better light of late morning and early afternoon, rather than fighting the dimness of late afternoon. These were not concessions. They were engineering decisions. She recorded everything in the 18th journal each evening. November 3rd. Section 1 extended to 23 feet. Wall integrity good. Air temperature differential at progress in 4 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than ambient surface. Gideon was right about the gradient. It begins before the cave mouth. The mountain extends its influence further than the obvious opening. November 5th. Right hand slower than left today. Inflammation in the base knuckle. Adjusted grip on spade handle wrapped with this section of leather strap from the toolbox. Workable. November 7th. First barrier installed between feet 14 and 15. Gideon's original work and my extension. The offset is correct. Air moving through the first section slows measurably at the turn. She measured it with a strip of thin cloth held at the transition point, watching the way it moved. Gideon had used the same method described in his 9th journal. The cloth did not lie the way instruments sometimes did. It showed you exactly what the air was doing, not what you expected it to do. Winifred Okafor appeared on the 11th day. Loretta heard boots on the path before she saw her. A deliberate sound unhurried the footfall of someone who was not trying to arrive quickly or quietly, but simply arriving at her own pace. She came around the south side of the cabin, carrying a covered pot and wearing a canvas jacket that had been repaired at both elbows with leather patches that did not match the jacket's color and did not need to. She was 71 years old, and she moved like someone who had made a decision many years ago to be exactly as slow as was required and not one bit slower. She set the pot on the step outside the cabin door. She looked at the trench, at the boards lining its walls, at the disturbed earth running toward the cliff face. She looked at this for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "He told me someone would come and do this." "He told you specifically," Loretta said. "He said, when I go, someone will come and either understand it or they won't. He said if they understand it, they'll start digging within the first week." She looked at the trench again. "You started in the first week." Loretta pulled off her gloves. "How long did you know him?" 14 years. I moved out here when my husband's sister died and left me her property, 3 miles south." Winifred nodded toward the valley. "Gideon came to introduce himself the second week I was there. Brought a jar of his beans. We talked on my porch for about 2 hours. He never came inside. He was like that. He'd give you the full weight of his attention, but only at a distance he was comfortable with. She said it without criticism. Loretta opened the pot. Bean soup thick with what smelled like dried rosemary. She had not eaten anything warm since the day before. She said, "Come in." They sat at Gideon's table. Winifred ate nothing she had already eaten, she said. She just brought enough for two out of habit. She sat with her hands around a tin cup of water and looked at the journals stacked on the shelf. "He showed me those once," she said. "The early ones. He explained what he was trying to do. I understood about half of it, and the half I didn't understand I trusted." Why was Winifred considered this? Because he didn't need me to understand it. That's how I decide whether to trust something. If a person needs you to understand what they're doing, they're still convincing themselves. Gideon didn't need anyone. He was just doing the work. Loretta thought about that. Then Winifred said, "They went after him twice, legally. You know about that? I read about it in the journals. I went to both hearings." She set her cup down. "The second time, the county brought in a geological assessor. Paid man, credentialed, very official. He stood up and explained that the cave formation posed a safety risk to anyone on the property, and that Gideon lacked the expertise to properly evaluate or manage it." She paused. Then Gideon stood up and asked the assessor how many consecutive daily temperature readings he had taken at the Dusk Pine Formation. Another pause. The assessor had been there once. One day, one reading. And Gideon had 17 years of daily readings. 14 years at that point. 14 years of readings every morning noted against the weather conditions and the outside temperature and the wind direction. Winifred looked at her steadily. They couldn't touch those records. You can't argue with daily evidence accumulated over 14 years. You can call a man eccentric. You cannot call his thermometer wrong. Loretta ate her soup. After a moment, she said, "Calhoun Brister came up here on the fifth day, offered $9,000 for the parcel." Winifred did not look surprised. "What was the previous offer?" "4.5 before Gideon died." "So it doubled." "Yes." Winifred was quiet for a moment. Then, "They didn't come after Gideon because they thought he was dangerous. They came after him because they wanted him gone. And when he died and they thought the land would go to someone who didn't know what they had, they waited." Thus, she looked at the journals again. "Now they know someone came who might know, so the price goes up." Loretta nodded. "What do they know about the land that makes it worth doubling?" Winifred looked at her directly. "That's not the question I'd ask." "What's the question you'd ask?" "What do they know that they think you don't know yet?" She stood, collected the pot. "There's a difference, Mom." She left without ceremony the same way she had arrived. Loretta sat at the table for a few minutes after the sound of her boots had faded down the path. Then she opened the 14th journal to the page she had marked 3 nights ago. "They know about the gradient. They have known for 10 years. They are waiting for the land to change hands to someone who does not." 10 years, the county survey Gideon referenced. She had not yet found the details, which journal, which entry. She went back to Journal 10 and began reading forward. She found it in Journal 11. A county geological team had visited the adjacent parcels, not Gideon's land, the land bordering it, as part of a regional geothermal assessment. Gideon had observed them from his ridge, had noted the equipment they were using, had noted which direction they ran their survey lines, had noted with his characteristic precision exactly where those lines terminated and what they did not include. His land. They had surveyed around him. Deliberately, it seemed, or perhaps because they had not had access, or perhaps because Gideon had met them at the property line with 14 years of daily records in his arms, in a manner that conveyed clearly he was not interested in their equipment on his slope. But they had found what they were looking for in the adjacent parcels. And the gradient that made Gideon's cave maintain 51 degrees in October did not stop at his property line. It ran beneath the whole ridge. His 14 acres sat above the strongest point of it. He had written, "The mountain is warmer at depth than it has any surface reason to be." This was always the explanation. The cave does not maintain its temperature because of its shape or its size. It maintains it because the stone beneath it is being warmed from below. Geothermal origin, almost certainly. A slow heat, enormous, unaffected by seasons, unaffected by weather, unaffected by anything that happens on the surface, and then one line below that's separated by a space. This changes nothing about what I am building, but it explains why what I am building will work, and it explains why they will want it. The second section of the channel was harder. At 30 feet from the cabin wall, the soil composition shifted, fewer roots, more stone, the kind of dense subsurface material that forms where water has been moving slowly through rock for a very long time and depositing minerals as it goes. The spade did not move through it the way it had moved through the first section. It bit and stopped. She had to work in shorter strokes, breaking the material apart in smaller pieces, removing it more slowly. Her right hand was a persistent problem, not debilitating, but present. The inflammation in the base knuckle spread occasionally to the wrist, and on those days she worked left-handed for the morning sessions and reserved right-handed work for the afternoon when the joint had loosened. This slowed her. She accepted it. She reinforced the second section with heavier boards. She had found an additional stack under the cabin's floor platform, which confirmed that Gideon had prepared materials for all three segments, had thought far enough ahead to stage the supplies even when he was no longer able to use them. This moved her in a way that she did not record in the journal. It was too private for recording. The image of an old man staging lumber under his floor for someone he would never meet, doing work he would never see, that was a kind of faith she did not have adequate words for. She installed the second barrier between the first and second segments. Offset opening, partial obstruction, air could pass, but it had to change direction to do so. Momentum broken, velocity reduced, each reduction compounded with the previous one. This was the fundamental logic of the whole system, and it was not complicated. It was patient. It was the logic of someone who understood that you don't stop a problem all at once. You slow it at every stage until it arrives somewhere harmless. By the end of the third week, the second segment was complete. She sat at the cave entrance that evening and wrote in the 18th journal, November 21st. Second segment complete. Total channel length, 41 feet. One segment remaining. The cave air temperature this morning, 50 degrees. Outside, 17 degrees. Differential holding at 33 degrees. This is the widest differential recorded since I arrived. Gideon's record in year 9 was 31 degrees in December. We may exceed it. She paused, looked at what she had written, and then added, we, I mean Gideon and I notice I have begun to think of this as a shared project. I am not sure he would object. The third segment presented a problem she had not anticipated because Gideon had not anticipated it either. She knew this because he had written it plainly in the 14th journal, the last year he had been well enough to work. Section 3 remains the problem. I have not solved it. He had identified the issue. The third segment, closest to the cave entrance, would run through soil that was heavily influenced by the freeze-thaw cycles of the surface. Winter frost in Wyoming penetrated the ground to a depth of 3 feet or more in a hard season. The third segment would sit at roughly 2 feet below grade at its shallowest point. Subject to freezing, subject to the exact same surface instability that the entire system was designed to avoid. A segment that froze was a segment that blocked. And a blocked segment meant the whole system's value was limited to the months when it was least needed. Gideon had sketched several solutions in the margins of the 14th journal, all of them crossed out. Deeper excavation crossed out because the rock composition made deeper excavation impractical without equipment he did not have. Insulating material around the exterior crossed out because the available materials conducted cold rather than resisting it. Heating the segment itself crossed out because any heating element introduced its own instability and defeated the principle of the whole design. She read those crossed-out solutions on a Tuesday evening in late November. Then she went to sleep. She woke at 3 in the morning the way she had occasionally woken throughout her life, not from a dream, not from a sound, but from the feeling that her mind had continued working while her body rested and had arrived somewhere and was waiting for the rest of her to catch up. She lay still for a few minutes looking at the ceiling. Then she got up, lit the lantern, and went to the shelf where she kept her sewing bag. She had brought it from Nebraska out of habit, not of expectation. It was a canvas bag within a canvas bag, the inner one containing her basic supplies, needles, thread in 6 colors, her small scissors, a seam ripper she had carried for 30 years, and several folded samples of different fabric types she used when consulting with clients about weight and drape and thermal behavior. She took out 2 samples. The first was a single layer of heavy wool. The second was 3 layers of lightweight gauze loosely woven stacked together. She held both over the lantern glass for 30 seconds each and then held both against her wrist. The wool, heavy, dense, expensive, transferred the heat quickly. The gauze, lighter, looser, a fraction of the cost, transferred it more slowly. Not because gauze was a better insulator, because between the loosely woven layers, air was trapped. Still air, motionless air, and still air and fabric, as in everything else, was the best available insulator. Not the material, the captured stillness inside the material. She sat at the table for a long time. The third segment's problem was not that it was too close to the surface. It was that the earth around it was in contact with the segment walls, and that earth moved heat, or in this case cold, directly through the wall material and into the air passage. The solution Gideon had been looking for was not a better wall material. It was a space between the wall and the earth, a thin, still space, air that could not move and therefore could not carry cold. Not insulation, capture. She went out the next morning and wrapped the completed first and second segments at every accessible joint, at every board connection, with 2 layers of the coarsest burlap she had found in Gideon's supply stack, separated by a wooden spacer the thickness of her thumb, creating a half-inch air gap between the burlap layers. Not airtight, still enough. The effect was measurable within 2 days. The temperature inside the first segment, which had been tracking ambient soil temperature at 3 feet depth, stabilized approximately 4 degrees higher. Not because she had added warmth, because she had slowed the removal of it. She applied the same principle to the third segment's design before she began excavating it, built the walls with the air gap burlap wrap as part of the initial construction rather than as a retrofit, dug more carefully, preserving the soil face at the exact distance required to maintain the gap. Took twice as long as the first 2 segments. She did not mind. On December 3rd, she wrote in the journal, "Third segment complete. The third section is the one Gideon could not solve. I solved it with burlap and a spacer and 40 years of understanding why layered fabric holds heat better than solid fabric. He was a geologist and a builder. I am a seamstress. We made a complete set. She installed the final barrier and the controlled entry door at the cave connection point, thick layered timber packed between the layers, with the same burlap and air gap system fitted as tightly as she could make it with hand tools and patience. The door was not elegant. It functioned. She opened it for the first time on a Thursday afternoon. The air that moved through was not warm. It was cool and steady and slow, slowed by 3 offset segments and 2 internal barriers, until it arrived in the space below the cabin floor, having lost most of its momentum and none of its temperature character. It spread along the floor stable, unhurried. She closed the door, waited, opened it again. Watched the cloth strip she had hung at the floor-level opening. It moved, barely, deliberately, the way a flag moves in the quietest possible wind, not driven, just present. She nodded once and went back inside. The weather radio on the shelf above Gideon's stove had been there since she arrived. She turned it on each morning for the forecast and turned it off again. The forecast through October and November had been routine cold, occasionally very cold, the kind of Wyoming winter that was simply the baseline condition of existence in this part of the world. On December 7th, the forecast changed. She heard it while she was eating breakfast. The announcer's voice had the quality of someone reading prepared text, but the prepared text had been written in response to something that merited preparation. A high-pressure system from the northern Canadian interior was moving southward faster than seasonal models had predicted. It would intersect with a moisture system building from the west. The combination would produce sustained winds above 40 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding gusty, temperatures dropping to -35 Fahrenheit, with wind chill extending that to -50 or lower in exposed areas. Duration estimated at 5 to 7 days beginning Wednesday. She turned the radio off and sat with her breakfast for a moment. Then she opened the 18th journal and wrote December 7th. Significant weather event forecast for Wednesday. Temperature projection, -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Ambient, -50 degrees Fahrenheit wind chill. Duration 5 to 7 days. Worst in 30 years according to the forecast. The system will be tested under conditions it was not specifically designed for. She paused. She looked at the channel entry point, visible as a low wooden frame set into the cabin floor near the rear wall. She looked at the stove. She looked at the boards on the north wall where the wind found its way through, and where she had, over the past 6 weeks, reduced though not eliminated the gaps. She looked at the thermometer on the shelf. Then she wrote the last line of the entry. System complete, untested under real conditions. She thought about Gideon, who had written every year for 17 years about what held and what did not, who had built his records one morning at a time, who had stopped when his body stopped, who had prepared materials for someone else to finish the work, who had known apparently from some combination of observation and understanding of character that she would be the one to come. She closed the journal. We'll know soon. Outside, the sky to the north had a color she recognized, not the soft gray of ordinary winter overcast, but a harder, flatter color, a color that did not negotiate. She had seen it once before in Nebraska, the winter her husband had been ill. She had watched that sky from the hospital parking lot and understood, without anyone telling her, that it meant something serious was coming, and that serious things, when they came, did not ask whether you were ready. You were ready or you were not. She went inside and checked every seal she had made over the past 6 weeks, every gap she had addressed, every board she had added, every joint she had packed. She checked the channel door. She checked the burlap wrapping on the accessible portions of the first segment. She checked the stove's fuel supply, the stack of split wood in the lean-to, the 2 additional logs she had moved inside 2 days ago, when her hands had told her the temperature was going to drop before the forecast caught up with it. Everything was as she had left it. Everything was as good as she could make it. She sat in the single chair and looked at the channel entry frame in the floor, and listened to the wind beginning to change pitch outside the north wall, and thought about the 14 acres of basalt slope that 6 men had laughed at, and the 17 kuons so Guy Chep, careful man, who had spent 17 years proving those men wrong, and the unfinished drawing on the drafting paper and the single line at its bottom. Finish what the mountain started. She had. The rest was the mountain's turn. The storm did not arrive the way storms arrive in stories. There was no single moment when the world changed. It narrowed. That was the more accurate word. It narrowed hour by hour, taking the distance away. First, then the color, then the definition of individual things, until everything beyond the cabin walls became a single and differentiated fact, cold white moving, and the world contracted to the size of whatever you could hold and keep. Wednesday morning, the wind was present but manageable. By Wednesday afternoon, it had committed. By Wednesday evening, it had stopped being weather and started being condition, the kind that does not pass through but settles, occupies, takes up residence in every gap and failure in place, where a structure has not been sufficiently deliberate about its own integrity. Loretta did not fight it. She had not built anything she intended to fight with. She adjusted the channel door to its narrowest functional opening, a gap of approximately 2 inches, enough to allow exchange, narrow enough to reduce volume. She made the fire small and steady, not large and reactive. She had learned from 6 weeks of daily observation that the cabin's new behavior did not reward large fires. Large fires created pressure differentials that pulled cold air through the remaining gaps faster than the stove could compensate. Small fires sustained, working in concert with the channel's stabilizing effect, produced a different result entirely. Not warmth in the way people expected warmth, immediate, enveloping, obvious. Something quieter than that. The cabin temperature dropped through Wednesday night, but dropped slowly. Where it had previously followed the outside temperature with the obedience of something that had no other choice, it now lagged. It fell behind the outside conditions by several hours. And several hours in a sustained cold event was the difference between manageable and not. She recorded the temperatures every 2 hours through the first night, sleeping in intervals between readings. Wednesday midnight, inside 31 degrees, outside -17. Thursday 2 a.m. inside 28 degrees, outside -22. Thursday 4 a.m. inside 26 degrees, outside -26. The gap between inside and outside was holding at 48 to 50 degrees consistently. The cave's influence, slowed, filtered, buffered through 3 offset segments and 2 barriers, was present in that gap. Not as warmth, as resistance to loss, as the difference between a system that was failing and one that was simply being tested. She put on every layer she owned and slept for 3 hours before the next reading. By Thursday afternoon, Dustpine was quiet in the way that towns go quiet under sustained pressure. Not the quiet of rest, but the quiet of effort directed entirely inward, every resource allocated to maintenance, nothing left for anything outward facing. She could not see the town from the cabin. She knew it was there the way she knew other things she could not see, by the logic of what surrounded it, by the pattern of what she had observed before visibility disappeared. She thought about the structures in Dustpine. She had driven through it enough times in the past 6 weeks to have noted them the way she noted most things, not with particular intent, just with the habit of observation she had carried her entire life. The residential buildings along the main road were what Wyoming called winterized, which meant they had been built with the expectation of cold, but not the expectation of this cold sustained for this long at these wind speeds. The difference mattered. Building for cold and building for sustained extreme cold were different engineering problems, and most residential construction in small towns solved the first problem adequately and the second one not at all. Calhoun Brister's building supply store was a large commercial structure on the south end of the main road. Metal-framed high ceiling, the kind of building that absorbed heat in summer and surrendered it in winter with equal facility, because thermal mass was not a concern when you were selling lumber and pipe fittings. It had a basement. She had seen the exterior access door on the east side, ground level heavy steel. Whether it connected to anything useful, she did not know. She thought about this on Thursday evening while she made the fire smaller and the storm made itself larger. Friday morning, she heard him before she saw him. Not a vehicle. Vehicles had become impossible sometime Thursday. Boots, the sound of a person moving through 2 feet of wind-driven snow with the particular determination of someone who has decided to go somewhere and has not yet fully accounted for the consequences of that decision. He appeared at the window first, a shape resolving out of white, a dark jacket, a hat pulled low, one hand raised against the wind. Then at the door. Not a knock, a fist once twice the sound of someone who has moved past the social register of knocking and arrived at the register of necessity. She opened the door. Calhoun Brister stood on the step. His lips were the particular color that lips become when blood has been redirected to more urgent locations. His jacket was adequate for a Wyoming winter and insufficient for this one. He was shaking, not the visible shaking of panic, the deep internal shaking of a body that has been spending its resources and is running low. She stepped back. He came in. She did not speak immediately. She went to the stove and added one piece of wood, not more, and adjusted the channel door fractionally wider. The room was 24 degrees. Cold by the standards of a thermostat, not cold by the standards of what he had just walked through. He stood near the stove with his hands extended toward it, and she watched the shaking in his arms begin to subside by degrees as his body decided that the immediate emergency was passing. After several minutes, he said, "The heating system at the store collapsed yesterday afternoon. Pipe failure at the main junction. I have 13 people in there, older residents mostly, 3 children." He stopped. 2 of the children are under 10. She looked at him. "Fuel supply is limited," he continued. "I've been running space heaters off a generator. Generator fuel will last another 36 hours at current draw. After that," he stopped again. "What's the temperature inside the store now?" 41 degrees when I left. It's been dropping about 3 degrees an hour." She did the arithmetic without comment. 36 hours of generator fuel, 3 degrees per hour, 41 degrees now falling. The timeline was not comfortable. She went to the shelf and took down the 18th journal and Gideon's 14th, the one with the channel diagrams and the marginal notes. She set them on the table. She pulled out the chair and sat down. "Sit," she said. He sat across from her. She opened the 14th journal into the cross-section drawing Gideon had made of the channel system, the one she had long since memorized, but which was clearer to communicate from than her own description. She turned it toward him. "Your store has a basement," she said. "Steel access door on the east side." He looked at the drawing, then at her. "Yes. How deep is it? 8-9 feet below grade. Does it connect to any existing underground structure? Old utility-run drainage channel, anything?" He thought. "There's an old mining access shaft, sealed in 1989, runs under the east side of the building. I don't know exactly how deep it goes. The county record said 60-70 feet. Loretta looked at the drawing. 60 to 70 feet of depth meant rock that had not been touched by surface temperature variation in decades. Rock that had been sitting at a stable gradient for decades. Not identical to the cave. Nothing would be identical to the cave without Gideon's 17 years of specific data, But the principle did not require perfection. It required sufficiency. She said, if you can access that shaft from the basement, even partially, and you can create a restricted connection between the shaft air and the basement space, you can slow the rate of heat loss in the building above it, not stop it. Slow it. He looked at the drawing for a long time. She showed him the offset principle, not connected directly, never directly, because direct connection imports the problem along with the solution. Offset, partial barrier. Slow the exchange to a rate the space above can absorb without being overwhelmed. She showed him the burlap air gap method, 2 layers separated, still air between them. The method of a seamstress, not an engineer, but the physics did not ask for credentials. She showed him what Gideon had understood and what she had completed. You do not generate stability. You borrow it from what is already stable. The mountain had been stable for longer than any of them had been alive. You connected to it correctly, and you borrowed what it had been holding for geological time. He sat across from her and listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not the behavior she had expected from him. She noted it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at the journals stacked on the shelf. He looked at the channel entry frame in the floor. He looked at the thermometer on the wall, which read 23 degrees inside, while the wind outside had not relented in any measurable way since Wednesday. Then he said, my store's heating collapsed last night. There are 13 people sheltering there. You said that. I know. A pause. I wanted to say it again because the first time I said it the way I say most things, like a problem I'm presenting to be solved. He stopped. It's my fault they're there. People came to my building because they thought it was the most solid structure on the main road. A long pause. I sold them that idea for 30 years, that my building was the solid one. She looked at him. It's not a bad building, she said. It wasn't designed for this. Nothing in Dusk Pine was designed for this. No, she said, but some things will hold better than others, and the ones that hold better turn out always the ones that looked strongest before it started. He looked at her steadily. Then he said in a voice that had lost whatever register he used in the world below the ridge, I knew about the geothermal survey. 10 years ago, county ran the assessment on the adjacent parcels. The gradient readings extended to this ridge. Everybody on the assessment team knew the highest concentration was under this 14 acres. A pause. Your uncle knew too. He was standing at his property line when they ran the survey. He could read their equipment. Loretta was still. He came to see me after, Calhoun continued, came into the store. This was 10 years ago. He was 71. He stood at my counter and he told me what the survey had found, and he told me what he was building. And he told me that if the county or any private interest tried to acquire his land, he had 10 years of records at that point, and he would use them the same way he'd used them in the county hearings. And then he said something I've thought about since. Calhoun looked at the window at the white nothing beyond it. He said, when I'm gone, whoever comes to that land will either understand what it is or they won't. If they don't, the land will go the way these things go, and the town will get a geothermal access deal that benefits the company more than the town, and everyone will call it progress. A pause. And if they do understand, he stopped. What did he say? He said if they understand it, Dusk Pine will finally have something it built itself, something that belongs to it instead of to whoever owns the rights. The wind drove against the north wall. The cloth strip over the channel entry moved in its slow, deliberate way. He told you that, Loretta said. Yes. And you still made the offers. I made the first offer the week after he died because I thought the land would go to probate and I could acquire it through the county before anyone else positioned themselves. A long pause. The other offers I made because I thought you were a woman from Nebraska who inherited a problem and would be glad to be rid of it. The room was quiet except for the storm and the small sound of the fire. I laughed at the reading, he said finally, because I thought you'd sell inside a week. She looked at him for a long moment. My uncle sat on a ridge for 17 years, she said, and he recorded 51 degrees at that cave mouth every morning. Not approximately 51. Not 51 on good days. 51. Because the mountain underneath him was keeping its own schedule, and he was patient enough to learn it. She closed the 14th journal. He didn't need anyone to believe him. He needed someone to finish it. She stood. She took 2 pieces of burlap from the supply stack she kept under the platform, bed remnants from the third segment's construction, and a length of wooden dowel and 3 coils of the baling wire Gideon had stored in the lean-to. She put them on the table in front of Calhoun. "This is what you're going to bring back," she said. "The principle is the air gap. 2 layers of fabric separated by the width of that dowel, stapled or wired to whatever frame you build over the shaft access. You're not trying to heat the basement. You're trying to slow the rate at which the basement surrenders what heat it has." She looked at him. "You can do this." "I'm not an engineer." "Neither am I," she said. "I'm a seamstress. It's the same principle." He looked at the materials. He looked at the journal drawings one more time. Then he picked up the burlap carefully, the way a person picks up something they have decided to take seriously. He stood. He put his jacket back on. He looked at her. "Winifred Okafor," Loretta said. She lives 3 miles south. She'll know the structure of that building better than you do. Her husband's sister owned property on your road for 20 years. She used to help with repairs." A pause. "Take her with you." He nodded. He went to the door, opened it. The cold came in complete and immediate. He stopped without turning. Gideon said one more thing that day, at the counter. A pause. He said the mountain doesn't care who owns the title. It'll keep its temperature regardless. The only question is whether the people on top of it are paying attention. He went out into the white. She closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment. Then she went to the channel entry frame and opened the door to its widest functional position. She needed the full exchange now, not for warmth, for information. She wanted to feel the system working at its limit, wanted to know what it had to give when asked for everything. The air that moved through was the same as it had always been. Cool, steady, indifferent to the storm in the particular way that things indifferent to storms are indifferent not because they are protected from them, but because they operate at a depth and a timescale that storms do not reach. She made the fire slightly larger and sat in the chair and watched the thermometer. 23 inside, -31 outside, a differential of 54 degrees. Holding. She opened the 18th journal. December 11th, storm day 4. Calhoun Brister came to the cabin on foot, 13 sheltering in his store, 2 children under 10. He left with materials and the air gap principle. He will attempt a partial solution at the mining shaft beneath the building. She paused. Then, he told me what Gideon told him 10 years ago. My uncle went to his counter and told him what the land was worth and what he was building and what would happen when he was gone. He told Calhoun Brister of all people because Calhoun Brister was the person most likely to take the land from whoever came after. And Gideon wanted him to know not to stop him, but to make him understand what he would be taking. She set the pen down. Gideon had not been naive. He had understood exactly how things worked in small towns, how land changed hands, how knowledge became leverage, how a geothermal survey could become a commercial interest if the land above it ended up with someone who did not know what they had. He had not tried to prevent any of it through legal structure or formal agreement. He had done something simpler and she thought more lasting. He had built a record that could not be argued with, and he had put her name on the envelope. The storm broke on the morning of the 6th day. Not suddenly. Storms of that character do not end with drama. They withdraw. The wind dropped first, not to nothing, to something that felt like nothing by comparison. The visibility extended from 10 feet to 50, then to 200, then to the tree line, then to the valley where dust pine sat gathering itself back together in the gray winter light. Loretta stood at the cabin door and looked at it. She had slept properly the previous 2 nights, the system having demonstrated by then that it would hold without constant adjustment, that it had found its functional equilibrium and would maintain it. She had slept 6 hours each night and recorded temperatures at dawn and dusk only. The numbers had been consistent. Inside, the temperature had not fallen below 21 degrees at any point in the 6-day event. Outside, it had not risen above -28. A differential of 49 degrees held continuously through the worst sustained cold event the region had experienced in 30 years, with a fire she had kept deliberately small, in a system that an old woman had built alone with hand tools and her dead uncle's notes and a piece of knowledge from 40 years of working with fabric. She wrote it in the journal without editorial. Just the numbers, just the dates, just the facts in the manner Gideon had taught her by example. Then she put on her boots and her heaviest coat and walked out into the aftermath. The snow had reformed the landscape. Every low point filled every path, buried every structure's outline softened by accumulation. She walked carefully, testing the ground beneath the snow before committing each step, and made her way to the cave entrance. The cave entrance was clear, not because someone had cleared it, because the air moving steadily outward from the cave's interior had prevented significant accumulation at the opening itself. A small arc of bare rock at the entrance, surrounded by 4 feet of snow on either side. She held the thermometer, 50 degrees, exactly. Outside, 19 degrees. She stood there for a long time. Winifred came up 4 days after the storm ended, when the county plow had made the road passable enough for a vehicle with good tires and patience. She knocked this time. She sat at the table with her cup and said without preamble, 13 people, all fine. 2 of the children had mild hypothermia symptoms. They're recovered. She set the cup down. The shaft access in the basement. Calhoun broke through the sealed panel Friday afternoon. It goes 63 feet. The temperature at the bottom was 53 degrees. Loretta looked at her. He used the burlap in the gap frame over the access opening. Winifred continued, built it wrong the first time I had to show him the separation. He'd compressed the layers together. Once he separated them, the basement temperature stabilized within 4 hours. Stopped dropping. A pause. It was 37 degrees in there. Would have been below 20 by Saturday morning without it. He figured out the separation himself. I showed him. He understood it immediately once he saw it. That's the thing about Calhoun. He's not stupid. He just leads with what he already knows. She looked at the stack of journals on the shelf. He's been telling people it was your design. Every person who asks him how the building held, he tells them it was your design and your uncle's principle. Loretta considered this. It was Gideon's principle. Yes, but Gideon's been gone 2 years and you're here, so people will start with you. Winifred looked at her with the directness of a woman who has stopped editing herself. They'll come up here, not all of them, but enough. People who lost heat and want to understand why some things held and others didn't. They should read the journals. Some of them will, the rest will need it explained in simpler terms first. A pause. You're good at that, explaining things in the terms the other person can use. Loretta looked at the channel entry in the floor. I explained it using a sewing analogy to a building supply store owner in a blizzard. And 13 people are alive, Winifred said simply, including 2 children under 10. The room was quiet. There's going to be a town meeting, Winifred said. Calhoun's called it. He wants to talk about winterization standards for the residential buildings. He's asked if you'll come. When the road's clear enough. 2 weeks maybe. Loretta thought about the 14 acres of basalt slope, the cave entrance swept clean by steady air, the channel running underground from mountain to cabin, built by an old man over 17 years and finished by his niece in 6 weeks with hand tools and burlap and a principle borrowed from a sewing workshop in Nebraska. I'll come, she said, but I won't be the one explaining. I'll bring the journals. Anyone who wants to understand it starts there. Winifred nodded. He documented it well. He documented it perfectly, Loretta said. He just needed someone to finish it. The meeting happened on a Thursday in January, 3 weeks after the storm. Loretta drove down from the ridge for the first time since October. The road was navigable barely. She parked in front of the community building and sat in the cab for a moment looking at the main street of Dusk Pine. Some structures had visible damaged roof lines that had shifted. One building with a wall bowed outward from the weight and cold, the post office with a section of insulation hanging loose from the eave where ice had worked its way into the seam. Not destruction. Evidence. The storm had shown every building what it was, and the evidence of that showing was written on the exteriors in ways that would take the spring to fully read. She went in carrying the journals, all 18 of them. There were perhaps 40 people in the room. She recognized some faces, Calhoun near the front standing rather than sitting as usual, but with a quality in his posture she had not seen in the lawyer's office. Less certainty, more attention. Winifred was near the back, hands in her jacket pockets, watching everything. Calhoun opened the meeting. He spoke plainly without the Chamber of Commerce manner she had observed in previous interactions. He described what had failed in his building and what had partially compensated for the failure. He said Loretta Voss had provided the principle and the materials from her ridge property. He said her uncle Gideon had spent 17 years developing that principle. He said the town had considered Gideon Voss an eccentric for most of those 17 years and had attempted twice to compel him off his land. He said this without qualification, without softening it. Loretta did not speak during the meeting. She was not there to speak. She sat with the journals on the table in front of her, and when people looked at her, she looked back, and when they asked questions, she answered them directly and briefly and pointed to the relevant journal when there was one. At the end, a woman she didn't know, mid-40s practical, coat the hands of someone who worked outdoors, asked what the journals were. 17 years of daily temperature records at the cave entrance, Loretta said, and 1 year of construction records. Mine. Where are they going? Loretta had thought about this on the drive down. The library, she said, references section. They're working documents. They should be available to anyone who needs them. The woman nodded slowly. What does someone need to know to use them? How to read a thermometer, Loretta said, and how to pay attention to the same thing every day for long enough that the pattern becomes obvious. Spring came slowly the way it always comes to high country, not as arrival but as retreat. The cold withdrawing incrementally, the snow receding to reveal the ground in stages, each stage showing what had been true under the surface all winter. On the first morning that the thermometer outside the cabin read above freezing, Loretta walked to the cave entrance with her journal and her thermometer and stood in the steady air and took her reading. 51 degrees. Exactly. Outside, 33 degrees. The first above freezing morning of the year. The differential had narrowed as spring approached. That was correct. That was what 17 years of Gideon's records predicted. The cave's advantage was greatest in deep winter and least in the mild shoulder seasons, because the mountain was most unlike the surface when the surface was most extreme. The cave did not change. The surface did, and the difference between them was the resource. She opened the 19th journal. She had bought it in Dust Pine on her way back from the meeting, a plain composition notebook, the same kind Gideon had used for 17 years. She wrote the date, the temperature, the differential. She wrote spring. The differential narrows. This is correct. The mountain has not changed. The season has. She thought about Gideon, who had written the same kind of entry on the first above freezing morning of every year for 17 years, who had not celebrated and had not complained, who had simply continued recording because recording was the thing that made the pattern visible, and the pattern was the thing that made the principle available to someone who came later. She thought about the 18 journals on the library shelf in Dusk Pine filed in the reference section under a handwritten card that said Voss Ridge Thermal Records 2007 to 2024. She had laminated the card herself with a piece of clear shelf liner from Calhoun's store. He had not charged her for it. She thought about the channel running underground from this spot to the cabin behind her Gideon segments and hers offset and layered and wrapped in burlap, and working every day winter and summer, borrowing stability from the mountain and lending it to the structure above. She thought about her husband, who had been a quiet man with excellent hands and a gift for seeing what things actually were rather than what they appeared to be, and who had told her once on the porch in Nebraska in the last summer they had together that the most useful thing a person could do was pay attention to what didn't change, because everything that changed would eventually stop, and what remained after that was what was real. She had not known then what he meant exactly. She thought she understood it better now. She closed the 19th journal. She looked at the cave entrance. The air moved outward slow and steady, exactly as it had moved on the first morning Gideon Voss had stood here 17 years ago, with a thermometer and a composition notebook and a question he had decided to take seriously. 51 degrees, regardless. The mountain had kept its own time through every season Gideon had recorded, and every season before that, and every season that would follow. It did not hurry. It did not respond to what happened on the surface. It held what it had been given and gave it back slowly, consistently, without drama to anyone patient enough to receive it correctly. She picked up her journal and her thermometer. She walked back toward the cabin. Behind her, the cave breathed its steady breath into the April morning, the same breath it had breathed in February and October and July, and every morning in between the same breath it would breathe tomorrow, and the day after, quiet and constant and entirely indifferent to whether anyone was paying attention. But she was paying attention. She always had been. That in the end was the whole of it.